Good evening, members of parliament, foreign dignitaries, corporate heads, senior public officials, media representatives, and other distinguished guests gathered here this lovely evening. My name is Mathisha Peiris, and I head the media research team at Verité Research, and I will be your MC for this evening. I would like to warmly welcome you all to the pre-budget forum hosted by Verité Research. This forum will focus on budgeting for revenue and growth, and will introduce to you 10 proposals to facilitate a conversation regarding the pathway to revitalize Sri Lanka's economy ahead of Sri Lanka's budget for 2024. To set some structure to our forum this evening, our distinguished guests will present 10 innovative proposals in 2 segments. The first segment will focus on enhancing revenue, while the second segment will focus on proposals revitalizing growth. Each segment will showcase 5 proposals alongside a panel discussion and an open forum for your questions and answers. We very much encourage your engagement with our work throughout this evening, and therefore we have arranged several ways in which you can engage with our panelists. You can submit the questions for the panel discussion via Slido by either scanning the QR code or entering the web link that will be shown on the screen soon. Or you can also verbally raise questions, and our team will be ready to provide you with a microphone. As we go on the panel discussion, we will have the Slido screen available for you to scan the QR code. But to kickstart our forum, I would like to introduce Dr. Nishan de Mel, who is the Executive Director of Verité Research, an economist with extensive academic, policy, and private sector experience. He has taught and researched at Oxford and Harvard universities, and he currently sits on multiple private sector boards where he consults regularly as a strategist for some of the region's largest firms. Without further ado, Dr. de Mel, I would now like to invite you onto the stage to deliver the introductory remarks.
Hi, everyone. So let me just keep this screen so that, are they able to use the phone and get this QR code right away? If you point it to the screen, you should all be able to get a link that allows you then to use it for asking questions. So we encourage you to actually put up your questions while the talk is going on and not wait to the end. So by the time the panel discussion comes, we'll have curated the questions, thought about it, and ready to answer. I just want to also just first of all say welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see so many of you here. We had to actually restrict the event. We had more than 200 requests to join, and at some point it was too many. But we are glad to have you here, and this is going to be a little bit of a rapid-fire event. The presentations are going to be done in lightning talk style, where each of us will take not more than about 6, maximum 7 minutes to make a presentation. The panel discussion also will be 20 minutes each time, and we'll focus on answering your questions rather than giving additional thought by the panelists. My task right at the beginning is to sort of set the stage and frame the situation. Of course, we haven't seen the budget yet. What we have is an appropriation bill, okay? But there is some information already available from the budget performance this year that we can take forward to how we understand the budget as it's about to happen and what needs to happen on the budget. So the first thing I want to say, and you're familiar with this because we've said it before, Sri Lanka spent the last 20 years, 22, never meeting its revenue targets on the budget. Of course, that needs to change, and what you see here is the revenue target set for 2023. Last year, at the same time, it was 3.4 trillion. Now, the issue is that it's okay to get things wrong because unexpected things happen, but last December itself, soon after the budget. We met you all, some of you, it was a much smaller event of 20. We invited you to what we call the Public Finance Lounge. And we said, actually, just logically and rationally speaking, given the policies that are articulated in the budget and everything we know, the maximum revenue we could imagine was 3 trillion, 11% short of what the budget said it would be. We revised it a couple of months later after looking at everything more carefully, and our 11% short went to 12% short. Actually, now we know, as the projections have been made, that we expect to be 15% short of the budget. Now, the issue is the following, that it does not make sense to plan around unrealistic revenue figures because it busts everything. You have to suddenly be reactionary, suddenly taxes go up, policies change, the economy becomes unstable. But we knew, right when the budget was presented, that there was no way the government was going to make those, and we even recommended policies that could get the government towards the larger number. And today we will unpack some of those policies we recommended. A few of them the government has picked up, and show you how implementing policies like that could have made a huge difference in the budget outcome. I want to just show you what the appropriation bill says in this budget. And this is capital expenditure, interest expenditure, and all other recurrent expenditure that you see on the graph. The total expenditure allocation is 6.5 trillion. It's the first time that Sri Lanka has exceeded 6 trillion in planned expenditure. Of course, every year the expected expenditure will go up, but we've broken the barrier of 6 trillion this year. But what's really interesting here is that the expected interest cost is almost the same as all other recurrent expenditure. So what we're expecting to spend on interest is 2.6 trillion, all other recurrent expenditure is 2.7 trillion. So looking forward, when we think strategically about economic recovery, we must remember that reducing the cost of interest is going to be the critical issue for Sri Lanka alongside increasing revenue. Why do I say that? What you see here is Sri Lanka's revenue, interest to revenue ratio. That is, what percentage of is interest cost to government revenue. It was at 72% in 2021. Our projection for 2022 is even higher, and we think this year also it will be close to this amount. And I'm going to end by telling you what it's going to be even if the budget plays out as we have planned at the moment. Now you can see the next highest is Zambia, Malawi, Brazil. These are not well-performing countries, but Sri Lanka is not only the highest in the world, but it's so extreme that if you had to pick one country where the economy is likely to fail based on the cost of interest to revenue, it would be Sri Lanka by far. And if you don't take that problem seriously and have a plan to solve the interest to revenue cost, then bringing debt under control is really difficult. Debt has to keep rising exponentially if you can't reduce the cost of interest to government revenue. And I think that problem is acute. Now let me show you how the budget sets out the interest cost for the next year against other costs. And of course, we think that we have a plan, right? So the IMF program provides a plan. So what is the problem? We should be fine if we implement the plan. Now, on the plan, so you can see the history of budget expenditure from 21 onwards. And this is the approved budget for 2023. That's how it was laid out. Now, the next highest, second from the top, is the IMF plan that we were following, because IMF started with where we were, and here's the plan for how we go forward. And when we look at the estimates for 2024, what has changed? Well, what has changed is that the interest cost expectation is 20% higher than in the plan, and we've taken that entirely out of capital expenditure. And that's how we are managing to try and stay within the planned budget. So effectively, Sri Lanka is going to look for ways to underinvest in growth in order to manage the rising cost of interest, which now is not going according to plan. The appropriation bill that you see is only laying out of expenditure in a macro sense. It doesn't tell you revenue, but actually we can work out revenue. How do we do that? Because we know the targets for the primary deficit, we know the targets for the total deficit, and this actually shows you that this 20% increase in interest cost is a 234 billion excess in the cost of interest against the plan that we were trying to follow. Of course, there are more than one reason for that, which we can get into question and answer time. But here's now where we are in terms of the target for revenue that you need to stay within the plan. Ultimately, the plan has a target to achieve a primary surplus of 0.8%. And to get there, Sri Lanka needs to have an increase in revenue of 45% in 2024 from what it was in 2023. So no mean task, and of course we are all aware of what is being done and not done with regard to that, but that is an introduction to where we are at the cusp of the budget. The government has to produce at least a 45% increase in revenue. The interest cost is already determined, and that is what it takes to stay on the plan. And when it does this, you're going to ask me, what is the interest cost going to be as a percentage of revenue? It's going to be 62%. So still leading the world, double the second highest, and a long way to go to get it into levels that will be considered sustainable. So, I'm inviting you to put on your seatbelts and get ready for a fast-paced set of talks that are going to walk you through 10 proposals that are oriented towards solving this problem, to grow revenue and to grow the economy. So these two things both have to happen. You can't grow the revenue and have economic growth not coming through. Economic growth without growing revenue, which is what Sri Lanka did for a while, is going to also get the country into trouble. So sustainable recovery requires not just revenue growth, also economic growth. So our sessions in two parts. We're going to do 5 proposals on revenue growth to start off with, and I'm going to invite Raj to walk you through the first proposal.
Prabu Rajakulendran is the lead economist within the economic research team at Verité Research. He specializes in providing in-depth analysis and expert insights on Sri Lanka's macroeconomic conditions and policies. His research areas include public finance, macroeconomic debt sustainability, and economic governance.
Thank you, Mahoshadi. So my first proposal is increasing withholding tax. And the slide here basically tells you that we have published the paper, and scanning the QR code will take you to that publication that we did along with the Sri Lankan Economic Policy Group. But I'm here to summarize one of the proposals mentioned there, which is to increase withholding tax. What is withholding tax? The withholding tax is a tax collection mechanism. It's not an additional tax. It's a way of collecting your personal income tax. And to give you an example, withholding tax functions like this. Let's say you have a fixed deposit in a bank and you earn interest income out of it. The bank withholds currently 5% of that interest income and remits to the government as taxes. And when you file for income taxes, you can claim this off, deduct it off your personal income tax. So this is not an additional tax, but a way of collecting your personal income tax. What is our proposal on this? Our proposal is to increase the withholding tax rate from the existing 5% to 10%. And if Sri Lanka had done that in 2023, this year, we could have gotten an additional revenue of 90 billion. It's a conservative estimate, which I'll get to. But 90 billion is almost equal to the amount you will collect through PAYE alone, pay as you earn, which gives you 100 billion, and this gives you an additional of 90 billion. Not only that, having a withholding tax rate of 10% also encourages people to file income taxes. In the IMF governance diagnostic and the civil society governance diagnostic, a common theme you notice is the amount of tax evasion and the issues with tax administration. Having a high withholding tax encourages people to file income taxes and also claim this off. The And now let me get into why I said it was a conservative estimate. We did these projections based on 2019 numbers, and like you see here, in 2019, the interest cost was significantly lower than what the interest rates are currently. So if you're charging a 10% withholding tax on current interest rates, you're going to get a higher revenue. And like Nishan said earlier, Sri Lanka has a high interest cost to revenue ratio and a high interest burden. So charging a 10% interest, charging a 10% withholding tax on interest income would help you cushion that high interest burden. And that is my proposal. And what my proposal does is, like Nishan again pointed out earlier, we have a shortfall for the current year. And if we had raised this to 10%, we could have covered 18% of the 15% shortfall. So this pushes the needle to a great extent. And that is my proposal for 2024. And moving on to Professor Mick.
Thank you, Raj. Our second speaker, Professor Mick Moore, will join us virtually this evening. Professor Moore is a political economist with broad research interests in domestic and international dimensions of good and bad governance in developing countries. He's a non-resident academic fellow at Verité Research and a senior fellow at the International Center for Tax and Development.
So Mick is finishing a class that's running late, Maho. He's just told us. So let's have Ashwin go next, if you can introduce him. And Mick says as soon as the class is over, he'll join, yeah. So Mick is in the UK, and so Ashwin, over to you, yeah.
Ashvin Perera is the lead data analyst within the economic research team at Verité Research. He has wide area of expertise, including economic analysis, predictive and probability modeling, and building machine learning models. His research areas focus on socioeconomics related to employment, with an interest in tobacco taxation and air quality. Over to you, Ashwin.
Thanks, Maho, and good evening to everyone present here. So the proposal I'll be dealing with is presenting a rational formula for indexing cigarette taxes. And this is actually quite an interesting area for taxation, particularly because you're not just protecting government revenue, but you are also focusing on preventing an increase in affordability of cigarettes, because as we know, smoking is a health hazard. And so to this end, what we actually see on the ground is that when you look at taxes and how they've been implemented today, in terms of the subjective nature when taxes get implemented, over the last couple of years, as you can see in the chart here, there's a relatively erratic nature in affordability over the past few years. And so this is something that needs to be taken account of when developing this kind of indexation formula. So the formula that we present, and again, this is also something that, to note, is highlighted as an IMF commitment. Our indexation formula deals with answering three particular questions. The first question looks at what we need to index cigarette taxes to. The second question looks at the different types of cigarettes that exist in the market and how we tax those different cigarettes. And the third question looks at how we pick the correct year to index to. And this is all presented in a paper. The QR code will be available at the end of my presentation. And I'll take you very briefly through how we actually do this. So the first problem we want to maybe sort out is affordability, right? How do we maintain a level of affordability? And so our first proposal is that we index the price of JPGL to GDP per capita. And what you end up seeing is, okay, we saw that erratic red line. Once you start doing this, we end up with a level of affordability that is quite stable, represented by this black dotted line here. And so we've tested this out on the data, and what we see is that by implementing this first proposal, you have a relatively stable level of affordability. So now we have a stable level of affordability. How do you then transition that into taxing on the cigarettes, right? And so the next proposal we have under this formula is that you then start adjusting the tax of other cigarettes in the market proportionate to the length of the JPGL cigarette. And so this chart again showcases to you some research that we've done before on this particular topic. And what we inherently end up doing here is we limit the ability of substitution, and thereby we protect revenue loss due to substitution. And again, this is all available in the paper that I will link you to at the end. Our third question then deals with how do you select a baseline year, right, to actually start indexing to, because we need a rational method for this part as well, because we want this to be as formulaic as possible and have the least amount of subjectivity. And so to this end, we have this method that we term the method of net least divergence. You can read about it later. I'm not going to bore you with the details of that. But this is how it's implemented. And the idea is if we're indexing price to nominal GDP, ideally we want to have a baseline year such that you have the least, that the two variables sort of follow each other as closely as possible. And that gives you a rational method for determining this baseline year. And so then the ultimate baseline year that we come to here is 1981. Now, we put these three parts of the puzzle together, and we can then estimate what government revenue will look like in terms of cigarette tax collection. And what we find out that is, if you were to index to 1981, you would end up with revenue of 143 billion rupees, and that is in comparison to what we estimate the government will earn of cigarette taxes today, which is approximately 107 billion rupees. Now, it's also important to note that selecting the baseline year is based on a rational method, and that we don't really, and that it's not trying to optimize revenue. For example, if we were to select 1992 as a baseline year, we'd end up with 147 billion. The idea being that we want something that's logical, rational. It makes sense, and it makes sense to implement. And so, yeah, if we end up implementing all these, implementing these different components of this indexation formula, what we are proposing is an extra 36 billion increase in government revenue as a result. That's the second proposal for you. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen. On to the next proposal. Thanks.
Raj, who spoke before, will now present the third proposal.
Thank you, Ashwin and Maho. So this proposal is on removing discretion on taxes. And I'm going to link it with something that very recently happened and has been getting a lot of traction, that is the sugar scam. But the underlying reason for the sugar scam is the law that the sugar scam took place on, which is the Special Commodity Levy Act. And the Special Commodity Levy Act allows a lot of discretion to one individual to change the taxes, not only the rate, but also by the type of product, but also by the type of person being taxed. So you and I could be importing the same product and having different taxes. The Sri Lanka's constitution also dictates that the parliament should be in supreme control of public finances, but this law allows a lot of discretion for a particular individual, especially the Minister of Finance, to decide on all of this and implement it with a simple gazette. And that is what led to the sugar scam. And this graph basically shows you how fluctuating taxes on sugar were. Now it's been revised back to 50 rupees, but there was a time when it was 200 rupees at one point. It was 40, it went to 48, it went back to 50, it went to 25 cents, that is the sugar scam, and now it's back to 50. And what the common response we get on why this sugar tax was reduced is to say that, oh, it's for the benefit of the people, the prices will come down. And what you see, the graph here, the dark blue line shows you the market price, and the red line shows you the cost for the importer, which is the import price plus taxes. And what you notice is before the SCL came down, before the SCL was reduced to 25 cents, the profit, the blue shaded area, was very minimal. It's almost impossible to show it on the graph because it was that minimal. And when the taxes went down to 25 cents, market prices did not come down, it actually went up. So the importers were actually benefiting from the tax reduction. So the benefit of the tax reduction was never passed on to the consumer, it was the producer surplus. And what was the cost to the government? This shows you by an annual breakdown. So the Auditor General did this report, and in his report he said from October 2020 till February we lost 16 billion. We extended the methodology because taxes remained at 25 cents till this month. And cumulatively, until now, we've lost 80 billion from October 2020 onwards. And for 2023 alone, we've lost 30 billion. So that puts into perspective the amount of discretion and vested interest this brings in. So it's not only a revenue problem, but also a discretion problem. And what the government has done now is fixing the revenue problem, but the underlying cause of the level of discretion still exists because the law still allows it. Just to put it in simple terms, even next month, the sugar taxes can go back to 25 cents. The systems are in place to do that. So what we need to do is not just fix the revenue problems, but also fix these underlying governance causes to remove the level of discretion to prevent another scam from happening. And that is my proposal. To summarize, it brings an additional revenue of 30 billion, and that would overall reduce the shortfall by 32%. And that's my proposal for 2024, removing the level of discretion. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Dr. De Mel will now take you through proposal number 4.
So just to say, I think Raj may have mentioned, but just to reiterate, the level of discretion on the changing the special commodity levy is so high that the minister can not only overnight have different taxes put on different products, from Bombay onions to sugar to whatever it is, but he can also give different taxes to different importers. So one importer gets this amount, another gets that amount. And in fact, that has also been done, right? I mean, the records we have are it's done for particular government entities getting lower taxes, but it's not always easy to know what was done and what was reversed a few days later. So, and these exact same level of discretion was in another tax proposal called the special GST, but that got challenged in the Supreme Court. And the court said, the way in which it offended the Constitution was so much that it was not enough to have a 2/3 majority in Parliament. It needed a referendum to pass. But that kind of ridiculously high level of discretion that, according to the judgment of the court, is now in the special commodity levy. And the governance diagnostic of civil society has asked that this be curtailed. The IMF has gone further and said that you should actually repeal this law, because these are the ways that the country has been losing revenue by giving undue discretion to decision makers. This next proposal that I'm going to present to you is about adhering to the formula pricing with regard to fuel. This, I must say, we haven't published yet, and it's quite new. You see that often the government says, here's how I came up with the price, here's the cost, and they publish it. But Verité Research runs what you call the public finance platform, which actually tracks the price of fuel against a reasonable price. Now, how do we come up with a reasonable price? You all remember the two ministers of finance, none of them are here right now, in 2017 or 18, when asked, how do you come up with the formula, held up this sign saying V1, V2, V3, V4, everybody laughed at them. But later we found that, well, all of these had a definition, right? So V1 meant landed cost, but ultimately, while they added taxes, added transport, added some processing costs, administrative cost, profit, wastage, they anchored the cost to the Singapore Platts price, because there was no reason for the base price to be different from the Singapore Platts price. And that was how you knew the formula was reasonable. It was a markup calculated in a particular way on the Singapore Platts price. Now, when we look at how this has got implemented in Sri Lanka, what you can see is that up to about February 2022, the formula price and the market price were quite similar. They tracked each other. And you can see that if I do this, that, there was no real gap. There's a little bit here and there, but ultimately the government's formula pricing and the price in the market tracked the reasonable price, which is a markup on the Platts price, of course, starting 2020 and whenever the formula was introduced. But after February 2022, something happens. Suddenly, the market price is a great deal higher than the formula price. So that is that pink area. That is, you are recovering much more than would be reasonable to recover on the basis of the costs being a reasonable markup on the global index. Now, why would government do that? Well, one reason, and that's the same for diesel, right? So this is not just petrol, but you see the exact same thing happening for diesel, which is on the right-hand side. Well, the reason is twofold, or that's the reason we are publicly discussed. We are told, the IMF told us that we must recover, that the entity can't run at a loss. So the entity must fully recover all its costs. The entity, for legacy reasons, has some very high costs. It has borrowed money and has very high financing costs. It has lost money on exchange rates, conversions, etc. And so to keep the entity from not making a loss, we have to add this price. Now here's our proposal. If you read the IMF technical reports carefully on this particular recommendation, they don't say that the entity must recover that excess money all on its own. The entity must be profit neutral, zero, after government transfers, they say. So they allow the entity not to make a loss, provided after receiving money from the government. They just don't want any losses that the entity makes to be hidden and not reflected in the government budget. So the government must reflect in its budget everything that's made a loss, and if it makes a loss, that's fine, except that then that must be a transfer from the government budget to the entity, so that at the end, after transfers, the entity does not make a loss. Now, so therefore, there are two ways to make sure the entity doesn't make a loss. One is to hike up the price for everybody. Two is to increase the taxes on petrol and diesel and use that increased revenue to make a transfer to the entity. The argument we are making is that the second way is better than the first. Why is that? It's because CPC is not a monopoly player. I'm just going to give you a hypothetical number to illustrate. Assume that CPC has 1,000 liters that it produces, and there is the current, and it's making 10 rupee loss. So it's trying to do a markup of 10 rupees. And then everybody pays 10 rupees, and it's an oligopolistic market, so the competition also marks everything 10 rupees high, and they make super profits. Instead of doing that, if the government increased the tax by 10 rupees, the government not only makes that 10,000 that CPC makes, but another 15% on top, because CPC has only about 87.6% of the market. So actually, it enhances government revenue, keeps CPC with the transfer once again, not making a loss, and transfers effectively super profits of the competition into government revenue, which is eminently sensible. What would we have made if we did that? This shows you what we would have made in 2022. We have data up to middle of July 2023. We extrapolate that forward, and we get 26 billion that the government would have made in extra revenue by using a extra tax to keep CPC non-loss making, rather than hiking up the price for everybody and allowing the competition to make an extraordinary profit. So how much does that add? You can see numbers going up, that it would have added another 26 billion to the 173 of the other proposals and taken us to 198 billion in extra revenue if this proposal was implemented. If you want to go take a look at the difference between formula price and the actual price in the market, you can follow our full price tracker on the publicfinance.lk platform and use the QR link to do that. Mick is here? Okay. So because Mick is not here yet, we will move ourselves towards the first panel discussion. I think Mahoshadi will introduce the panel, and I hope you put your questions on Slido. We are going to be quick and short, so 20 minutes, we are going to take your questions and move forward from there onwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Mel, Raj, and Ashwin, for your insightful presentations and proposals on enhancing revenue. I would now like to move into the panel discussion and open forum, giving you all a chance to engage with our presentations and panelists lined up for this evening. As Nishan mentioned, you can send in your questions using the Slido feature mentioned, or simply by raising your hand to request a microphone. And if you do, we would like to request that you please state your name and your designation when you are making your question. To moderate our panel this evening, we're joined by Ashvin Perera, who is a strategic advisor to the Executive Director at Verité Research, who has extensive experience in the financial advisory sector. Our esteemed panel for this segment will be made up of Subhashini Abeysinghe, who is the research director at Verité Research and an economist specializing in international trade. She has worked for the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for nearly 10 years as a senior economist and is a visiting lecturer at the Faculty of Graduate Studies of the University of Colombo and Sir John Kothalavala Defence University in Sri Lanka. Secondly, Professor Shanta Devarajan, who will join us virtually today. He is a professor of the practice of international development at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He's also an advisor to the government of Sri Lanka on debt restructuring and multilateral engagement, while being a non-resident academic fellow at Verité Research. They will be joined by Dr. De Mel on stage. I would now like to invite you all to take a seat at center stage and hand over the floor to Ashvin.
Hi, Shanta. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So we have 20 minutes reserved for questions, and this discussion will be definitely enhanced if you ask any questions, any clarifications you have. We're here to help, and we're here to answer and clarify. With us, we're joined by Shanta, Professor Shanta Devarajan as well, and Mick was supposed to be on this panel. Hopefully he'll come even in between. If you all weren't able to submit the questions digitally, please raise your hand and indicate to one of my colleagues, and we will pass the microphone on to you. But without further ado, let me start with some of the questions that have come through. And from the onset, Subhashini. Subhashini is our head research director at Verité Research. And what we want to ask you, Subhashini, is in terms of all that was said and all the, we had a lightning round of all these suggestions and reforms that we think will enhance the revenue. Have we brought these reforms to the government? This has been a repeated question that has come through from the audience in different ways. So let's answer that question first and foremost and dive into the...
The simple answer, Ashvin, is yes, and not once, multiple times over multiple years, especially things like cigarette taxation. I think for nearly more than 5 years or even more, we've been presenting this over and over again. So a simple short answer is yes.
Okay. So what we saw was that the interest costs has been going up, and it has gone up in 2024, and there is a redistribution from capital expenditure to interest cost. And what I want to ask Dr. Nishan de Mel is why has the interest costs increased this year? What has happened with the debt restructuring? Shouldn't the interest costs actually have reduced? And why are we seeing this interest costs go up in 2024?
Yeah. Why is 2024 high, and how do we understand the challenge of bringing it down? Interest is very much a function of liquidity and risk, and liquidity in relation to demand. Of course, when the government runs high budget deficit, I often say the government has become like the cookie monster. All the available money, it's being swallowed up. Give me another cookie, give me another cookie. And there is no money left on the table for other people who want to borrow. So, of course, the cost of borrowing keeps going up. But there's a second reason now when interest cost goes up. When the internationals lend to us, there is something called a rating that you have. And the cost of interest of borrowing internationally is directly related to the rating. So when you get a B rating, you're probably paying 5% above the risk-free rate, which we say is the US Treasury rate. When you go to B minus, it'll become 15 and you're effectively priced out of the market. If you can get your rating up, your interest cost goes down. If your international borrowing cost goes down, your local borrowing cost also goes down, because if the locals are not willing to lend you at a competitive rate, you can shift and borrow outside. So getting the risk perception on the country down is a critical aspect of making borrowing cheaper. And looking forward, Shini, that is about demonstrating that Sri Lanka's current plan will sustainably be a one-time debt restructuring, that you're not on a plan to have a repeated debt restructuring in 3-4 years' time. If it seems like the government has not got its act together, that things are not moving in a direction that seems sensible, the governance problems are not solved, because that is something people are looking at very seriously, the perception of risk increases, and even local organizations and banks worry about lending to government for more than a year or two. So you can see that even today, the interest cost is becoming rather sticky. Soon after the local debt restructuring, it looked like it came down, and then people started doing the math, thought about where the government is, and it's becoming quite difficult for the government to borrow at under 14% today, which is well in excess of a sustainable level. Now, I think last year, many of you would have come. We had another room packed of 200 people, but mostly investors, where we say, or investment bankers, we said, look, very quick domestic debt restructuring, that is a reprofile. That means you don't have to do any haircuts, simply extend the term of debt sufficiently, and we said by 10 years, the rollover, because that solves two problems. That solves the liquidity problem. The government doesn't have to keep going to the market to borrow. And secondly, it also, when you do the numbers, it shows that when that is done, the government's sustainability dynamics improve tremendously, and immediately then you de-risk the market, bring interest costs down, and you're on a more sustainable path. Now, we also put all the calculations, the Excel sheets, the functions, the mathematics out in public on our website and said, look, anybody can crunch these numbers and see that this makes imminent sense. I think, unfortunately, the government thought, no, we don't have to do any domestic restructuring. We refuse to do it. We won't do it. And then come 8 months later, they actually did much worse. They went and did a haircut also, and then targeted only one segment of the savings and not the others, so it's not even clear that it was adequate. But, there is a real, I think there is a real need for Sri Lanka now to take sensible, analyzed policies and implement them on time, not wait for it to get to a crisis level. So effectively what happened is you postponed it till it was more critical and a level of crisis, and then also did something hurried and perhaps not calibrated adequately. And I think the important thing when we look at the budget is to say a lot of the sensible policies, what we are presenting today, what's been published in diagnostics, are already known. The question is, will we see them in the budget? Will we see them implemented? And that will help to bring interest costs down.
Thank you, Shanta.
Long answer, sorry.
Yes. So for the next question, I'd like to ask Professor Shanta Devarajan. He's a professor of Georgetown University and advisor to the government of Sri Lanka on debt restructuring and multilateral engagements, and a non-resident fellow of Verité Research. So following up to Nishan's answer, Shanta, how do you see the impact of this redistribution with the IMF program? How will this make completing the IMF program difficult? What do you foresee in terms of the interest costs going up at the expense of capital expenditures? What are the implications to completing the IMF program successfully?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for those very illuminating presentations. I think the key point, as Nishan mentioned, is how are we going to change the risk perceptions of Sri Lanka? So it's more than just the IMF program. The IMF program provides a framework around which Sri Lanka can undertake the debt restructuring and macroeconomic stabilization, and that's going well. But the key to the debt restructuring, and therefore to bringing interest rates down, is for the government to demonstrate that it is seriously committed to fiscal austerity. This has been the problem. We know that what caused the debt crisis was fiscal laxity and in a big way. And while the government is making some steps towards that, I think the problem that inspired this seminar, which is the revenue shortfall, is an example of where, while the government might commit to a high level of revenue, when push comes to shove, they actually make discretionary moves that actually lower revenue. So until the government actually demonstrates its commitment to fiscal austerity, I don't think the risk perception is going to come down. And that involves doing things like what was proposed on the special commodity levy. That is, for the government to give up its own discretion. What markets are looking for is the government willing to tie its hands so that it can't undertake these excesses that it has undertaken in the past. And I think there's a whole range of things that the government needs to do to demonstrate credibly that it's willing to tie its own hands.
Do you want to elaborate further on what those might be from the government side?
Okay, sure. Be happy to, but let me take some of the big ticket items, right? The government borrowing from the central bank. I mean, what caused the high inflation over the last 3 years that went up to 70% was that the fiscal deficit was financed by borrowing from the central bank. This is a textbook example of how you get high inflation. The way many countries do it is by actually forbidding government borrowing from the central bank. That it's illegal. That's the case in the United States and several developing countries as well. Now, Sri Lanka has a central bank bill that goes towards in that direction, but shall we say the original proposal in the bill was that in 6 months, the government would be forbidden from borrowing from the central bank. When the bill emerged from Parliament, it was 18 months. So already you're extending the time at which the government can continue to borrow. And that is an example where the government has actually retracted from a bill that has attempted to tie the hands of government from borrowing from the central bank and thereby control inflation, which is an important signal that the investors are looking at.
Thank you, Professor. We have a short period of time for questions. Are there any questions from the audience that we can take? Yes.
Over here.
Thank you for the opportunity. So we see the recurring expenditure of the government has reached 6 trillion. And whatever the numbers we put on government revenue, it can hover around 3 trillion. So there's a gap of 3. Now, the question that I have is, we are only looking at tax revenue. We actually can't do this. Movie tax, it contracts consumption and savings, and the cycle won't work, right? And now we are saying tying the hands of the government. Can we really do this? Practically, if you look at the numbers, unless the non-tax revenue is increased within next 5 years, and a probable infusion has to come in to enhance the production, because the capital expenditure is at stake now. So I just want to understand, if we limit all these variables, how do we really go forward from here?
Just to be clear, the 6 trillion number comes with capital expenditure included. When you take that out, it's about 5.3 trillion. I'm going to actually invite Shanta to respond to that, Chaturanga, because it'll be always good to hear more from Shanta and less from me. Shanta, you heard the question, I'll pass it to you, yeah.
Thank you. I was hoping you would ask me to answer that question. I like that question. No, you're absolutely right that we cannot just rely on tax increases to get us out of this mess. And in fact, I think even within tax increases, keep in mind that most of these proposals are also shifting the composition of taxation from highly regressive taxes to ones that are less regressive. And those actually, there's some evidence that if you can keep the tax rates or the tax revenue constant, shifting the composition can actually stimulate growth because the current set of taxes also can impede growth. But I think the broader point about your question, which gets to the second half of this session as well, is that there are many things we can do, given this fiscal constraint, to increase growth by shifting the composition of public expenditures, including capital expenditures. I mean, I want to qualify something that my colleague Nishan de Mel said earlier, that we're constraining capital expenditures and therefore constraining long-term growth. Well, the evidence is that not all capital expenditures lead to higher long-term growth. And in particular, in Sri Lanka, we have a long history of investments that have not yielded growth. I mean, I don't even have to mention, you all know what I'm talking about. So we have to also change the composition of capital expenditures so that they are more productive, even if we're keeping the level the same or even lower. There can be a lot more growth made out of capital expenditures. And then finally, I think recurrent expenditures are also currently not helping growth. You can increase recurrent expenditures on growth promoting activities, including, and I would just mention 3, maintenance of infrastructure, which is part of recurrent expenditures, which is grossly underspent in Sri Lanka. That's not new capital expenditures, not new fancy projects, not new ports and airports and things like that, but take the existing ports and airports and roads and maintain them better. That is the recurrent expenditure that we can do that has been shown to have huge effects on growth.
I'm going to add a couple, but go fast. As Shanta says, we know so many of the answers. Just taking the recurrent expenditure, childhood malnutrition is high in Sri Lanka. Yet nutrition at a young age is a huge part of the development of human resource capability in a country and comes back as economic productivity and growth in the future. So things that, so investing in education, investing in healthcare, these are also ways of improving productivity in an economy. And Sri Lanka can do a great deal more in preventive health, in public health, in better tertiary education that makes people a lot more competitive and capable of contributing to the economy and makes people less interested in going out of the country. So I think there are investments like that. Secondly, widening the tax base. So it's not about increasing the rate. There are far too many people in this country who don't pay taxes and pay far too little of their income in taxes. So the first proposal on WHT is saying, look, that's one way to capture that group. You actually, when you take with WHT, they can't evade it, and if you've taken too much from somebody, they can come and say, please return it, because it's only a withholding tax. But you effectively catch people into the tax net that are avoiding it. Mick couldn't do his proposal, but another entire set of proposals we had was on how you register people for taxes. All professionals, many here, you have to renew your professional license annual. Government can say, professional license renewal must be associated with a tax file. And you can then use that to ensure that every professional has a tax file, rather than slightly less productive idea of trying universal registration. Getting 15 million tax files is going to drown the department in unproductive tax files. You've got to make sure you get the productive tax files on board. You can use banks to do the same thing. Say anyone who has fixed deposits above a certain amount, they can't open that fixed deposit or have it if you don't have a tax file. So there are so many methods in a targeted way that we can use to bring people into the tax net, and we can reduce the tax rate if we are very successful with that. But now, because in most countries, people pay a much greater proportion of GDP in taxes, so Sri Lanka can't be overtaxed. It's that we are undertaxing the number of people is undertaxed, therefore the few that are taxed may feel overtaxed, but that's wrong. So it's not that we mustn't increase tax revenue, we must, but we must change the way in which we collect that revenue to make it more fair, more productive, and grow the revenue of government. So I'll stop there.
So we are approaching the end of the session, but we have time for one question, and this question will be in two parts.
Okay, and there's another question here too. Yeah.
So two questions then. Yes.
Right.
Yes, Mike.
Hi, I'm Michael from Haley's. So this question is to Nishan or Professor Shanta. So there is talk of many elections happening next year. It could be parliamentary, it could be presidential. And there has also been talk of the IMF agreement being renegotiated. And we just saw that the staff level agreement was just agreed on just a few weeks ago. So if a new party comes into power, what could be the impact on Sri Lanka if the IMF agreement is renegotiated?
Shanta, do you want to try that question, or do you want me to go ahead?
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what I know.
Shall I come in on that? Is the next question for Shanta?
Maybe you should do it.
Next question, Shanta can
So
also
I'll tell you a brief answer, okay? We all talk about stability. That means we want to know what is the future like. I argued, in February 2022, that we should just have an election as fast as possible. Trying to get stability without legitimacy is a losing battle, because it comes back to bite you. And you are never going to postpone elections forever. So the faster you have the election, the decks are on the table, everybody knows, you have 5 years at least going forward. Otherwise, everybody just starts wondering, when is the next election? We must have an election. What is exactly your problem is going to come up? So the easy solution is a quick election. If you can't have a quick election, at least then, government must find a way to agree with other parties in parliament that seem to be popular on the pathway. It can't be my way or the highway. There has to be and it also can't be saying everybody must agree with government. We've done a survey on this actually, and we know what people think. I won't announce it today. So there has to be a way where government can make policy in a collaborative way that allows for support, but that can't be simply saying everybody must agree with whatever the government is doing. Because if government can agree with most parties, then there's a sense that the society itself is going to be behind that policy. So I'll just stop there.
Can I just add one comment? Because I think the question was, is there a risk that if a new party comes into power, that the IMF agreement will have to be renegotiated? And I think I am maybe optimistic that the answer is no. There is a sense that all the parties are broadly in agreement with the direction of the IMF program. And the reason I say this is, we had that seminar, I think, Nishan, you were there in February or March of 22 with the opposition, the then opposition leaders, including Ranil Wickremesinghe, in Parliament, where we explained the IMF program and debt restructuring, and they all signed a joint letter, the whole opposition, asking the then president that he should undertake a debt restructuring and go to the IMF. And this was remarkable because these, my sense is that these opposition leaders don't agree on a whole lot else, but they did agree on this one thing. And that actually was very important to give the IMF some confidence, given that there was all this political uncertainty in the country, to go ahead with the program. And I think what the rhetoric I hear now from all the different parties is, while they might have some differences about specific details of the IMF program, the general thrust of restoring debt sustainability or restoring external sustainability to Sri Lanka is something they all share. And that is what is needed to keep the IMF program on track.
Go to your next question.
Professor Mick Moore is online, and I think the next question is for Professor. The question is, why is the government increasing VAT and only exploring inflationary reforms? So since we had a proposal shared earlier on withholding tax increase, what are the actual specific reform mechanisms that should be suggested and implemented is the first question. And the second question is directly from your research on the property taxes. Can you elaborate more on the redistributive aspect of it and the equity argument for the purposes of the audience?
Okay, how many minutes would I have to answer this?
You can take 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, fine. My apologies for this scheduling problem. I think the answer to the VAT problem, without knowing exactly why government did it, is that in Sri Lanka, we now have a situation where the tax system has been severely neglected in almost every sense of the term for several decades. And the capacity of government to raise taxes from places it should be raised is rather limited. And when government is desperate for revenue, it actually has a limited range of choices. And therefore, increasing a tax like VAT is an obvious thing to do, as opposed to a whole range of more specific measures that will take a little bit longer to introduce. So that's a general answer. Let me now go on specifically to the question of property taxes, which is an excellent case of a tax that should be collected, but actually isn't being collected at the moment because we don't have a system for doing it. So the government is committed to raising taxes on wealth. Taxing wealth is extremely difficult because the information available on people's wealth is very limited, and especially in Sri Lanka. So I think currently we should reduce or refine that objective into taxing property and specifically real estate. And the central reason for that is that if we have to have taxes, taxes on real estate, property taxes are actually by far the best taxes available. There are essentially two reasons for that. One is that it is relatively easy to identify properties, buildings, whether they're residential, commercial, or industrial. Not a big challenge, and as I'll explain in a minute, it's got easier. The second one is that any tax on real estate and property is almost by definition going to be progressive because wealthier people own more property. And the third reason why property taxes are very good is that they don't actually discourage anything very significant. Income taxes at some level discourage us from earning income. Sales taxes, to some extent, discourage us from buying things. Property taxes, the worst they're going to do is discourage us from building slightly bigger houses, but that's not a problem. So they're excellent. They are much underused in Sri Lanka. They account for about 1% of total government revenue. Sri Lanka is not alone in this. It is generally true worldwide that property taxes are much underused. The reason for this goes back to the point I made earlier, that property taxes are progressive, and therefore wealthier and more influential people do their best to prevent property taxes being effective. One way they do this in Sri Lanka and in many other countries is to stick with this very old-fashioned system of direct manual valuation, revaluation of individual properties for rates. And once you're stuck with that system, you're stuck with a property tax system that is going to grossly underperform. But the possibilities of raising property taxes have suddenly transformed in the last 2 or 3 years, not because the politics have changed, but because of technological change. This is essentially IT issue. And any government that wants to set up a significant remunerative and fair property tax system now can take advantage of possibilities that weren't there a few years ago, and quite a number of governments are doing this. So what I'm going to summarize is what's happening in quite a few cities, especially throughout the world. Number one, you set up a new organization. Secondly, you employ large numbers of digitally literate people, which mainly means young people. Thirdly, you employ satellite imagery and GPS to identify and locate all properties. Fourthly, you then send your young people into the streets with laptops, iPhones, maybe even drones, to collect a little bit of additional data on each property so that you can classify each property into, say, 6, 7, 8 groups in terms of the location, floor area, construction quality, etc. And then on the basis of that information, you could actually value every single property for property tax, whether that's capital values or rental values, not with the same refinement that the rental system does, but much, much more efficiently and good enough for taxation purposes. And then you can simultaneously establish an IT system that covers the full range of functions: valuation, billing, payments, appeals, enforcement, etc. So the options and opportunities have changed. I would stress 2 things if any government wanted to do that. This way of collecting taxes doesn't overlap very much at all with the other ways of collecting taxes. So this does not need to be done by the Internal Inland Revenue Department or any other existing tax system. It needs to be done centrally. If it's devolved to local governments, nothing will happen for a very long period of time. The key issue is going to be how you share the revenue between different levels of government. But I would suggest that central government has to have a reasonable share of revenues just to give it a good incentive to make this system work. So that is the essence of the story. Very happy to give anyone interested more details. Thank you.
I'm going to answer a quick audience question that I saw that said, with the proposal we put on taxation on petrol, will prices go up? It's actually price neutral, because when you're doing it on the formula, when you have a 10 rupee markup, or you keep to the formula and pay 10 rupees extra in tax, the price and the pump will be the same, but government revenue will increase. So it's a price neutral proposal. I saw that on Slido. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure. So I think we'll come to a close. We covered a lot of ground today. And to briefly recap, we seem to have explored few reforms that are backed by analysis, that have the capacity for the government to increase revenue equitably, fairly, and in a non-inflationary manner. So thank you to our experienced panelists. They brought their own unique perception and perspective to the table, and allowed us to have a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our moderator, Inoshini, and our distinguished panelists, Professor Devarajan, Subhashini Abeysinghe, Professor Mick, and Dr. De Mel, for that thought-provoking discussion. We will now commence our second segment of the forum, which showcases 5 proposals that's aimed at revitalizing growth. To kickstart this segment, the first proposal will be presented to you by Subhashini Abeysinghe.
Thank you, Maho. So let's go to the first proposal of the second session, revitalizing growth. So human resources is one of the greatest assets a country has, and the ability to make best use of this valuable resource is critical to enhance growth. And in this, Sri Lanka has miserably failed in terms of getting Sri Lankan women to contribute to the economy, especially in participation in labor force. So Sri Lanka's, this has been a problem identified for a long time. So compared to male labor force participation, only half of that rate is the level of participation of women, and in terms of unemployment, it is twice the rate. So what basically, among many reasons, we feel discrimination women face in the labor market because of the current regulations or the laws around maternity benefits is a clear reason which prevents women from gainfully employed. So what this data clearly demonstrates is that women of childbearing age are discriminated in the labor market, and the unemployment rate is several times higher, 5.7 times higher than the women of other age categories, and they're much more likely to be unemployed. And this is what happens is, like, basically research also shows that private sector, obviously, because they are bearing the full cost of maternity benefits right now, always finds it is more costlier to employ women compared to a man. And as a result, there is significant discrimination at recruitment. So I think I have a problem with the slide. Sorry about it. So Sri Lanka is actually party to an international convention on maternity protection convention, and since 1993. And basically, the convention clearly states that benefits must be provided either by means of compulsory social insurance and by means of public funds. And it clearly says, in no case shall the employer be individually liable for the cost of such benefits due to women employed by him. However, Sri Lanka has not been compliant with the convention. If you compare across the world, 129 states provide maternity benefits, and 96 states provide fully state-funded, and 33 partial. So we tried to correct this, this non-compliance in 2019 by agreeing not to fully fund maternity benefits, but partially fund maternity benefits. However, it never got implemented. What is unfortunate is, if you look at the cost of social welfare programs and the benefits, cost of funding maternity benefits is actually costs far less than social welfare programs that are currently in place in Sri Lanka. And this will contribute immensely. There is research that shows actually state-funded maternity leave boosts labor force participation, and it can range anywhere between 10 to 20%. So there is clearly documented evidence. Despite this, however, Sri Lanka has failed to do so. So this research is published, and you can find by scanning the QR code, and we do hope that Sri Lanka will take the measures necessary to make the best use of this valuable human resource that currently is heavily underutilized. Thank you.
Thank you, Subhashini. The next proposal will be presented by Professor Shanta, who will join us virtually.
Hello again. I'm going to start motivating this proposal by talking about targeted cash transfers, because I think that's the linchpin to a whole series of reforms that can be growth enhancing in Sri Lanka at the moment. And it's no secret that the existing cash transfer program, Samurdhi, has been very poorly targeted. We have estimates of only about 60% of the poor were receiving the samurdhi transfers, and a good 20% of the highest quintile, the richest quintile, were also receiving samurdhi transfers. So we have errors of inclusion and errors of exclusion. And that has persisted for a long time, including quite recently. Well, that has persisted for a long time. And one of the reasons why it has persisted, this mistargeting, is because the cash transfer program, like in other countries, has been used as a tool of political patronage. I mean, there was a study done in the Samurdhi of the 2000s where they showed that when they looked at the distribution of Samurdhi benefits across different districts, and they found that those districts which had voted for the party in power in the last election got a overwhelmingly large share of the Samurdhi transfers. In fact, it's those districts that had voted between 40 and 60% of the incumbent party that got the peak level of Samurdhi transfers. And there's anecdotal evidence, there are interviews saying that the Niyamakas were told, do not, you make sure you give these benefits to the people who voted for the party in power, and do not give it to those who voted for the opposition party. And I think this came out more recently with the Aswasuma program as well, where when the Aswasuma program was announced and the list of people eligible which was approved by Parliament was published, there was huge protests. And it was clear that the party members from a particular party were the ones who then turned around and said, no, we have to put these people back in the back on the list, those who were excluded from the list in the first place. So there's a real problem with conditional for these cash transfers, that politicians can use it as a way of currying favor with their political supporters. So I think the first order of business is to have as objective a method of assessing eligibility for the cash transfer program. And I think the proposal done by my colleagues at Verité and Professor Delaney Gunawardena of using the electricity bills is a good one, because that's something that can be objective and cannot be manipulated. So I think we should consider that. Now, why do I emphasize the cash transfer, the targeting of the cash transfers? Is because that if you have a well-functioning targeted cash transfer mechanism, that permits you to undertake some of these politically difficult reforms, such as the reform of energy subsidies and fuel subsidies and electricity subsidies, as well as some of the SOE reforms. Because many of these reforms, such as energy subsidies, are resisted and politically very sensitive because people say, well, they will hurt the poor. But now if you look at energy subsidies and look at who benefits from energy subsidies, it makes the targeting of cash transfers pales in comparison. That is, you know, when I said about 20% of the poor, 20% of the richest quintile are getting the Samurdhi transfers, it's about 60% of the richest quintile who get the energy subsidies, because they're the ones who drive gas-guzzling cars and have air conditioners and consume all that electricity. So think about it. The fuel subsidies or the energy subsidies are a transfer to the richest 20% of the population, and it's the overwhelming share of that transfer. It's a hugely inefficient way to help poor people. And yet, whenever you try to reform these subsidies, the clarion call is, oh, this will hurt the poor. Now, I think that call is being made by people who are not poor on behalf of the poor, and these people are the rich who stand to lose quite a bit from these energy subsidies. But if you can accompany that with a cash transfer that is targeted to the poor, then you can credibly respond to the criticism that the subsidy reform is going to hurt the poor. Because you're saying we're going to cut the subsidies and use some of the money. You don't have to use all of it, since 60% of it was going to the non-poor. You can use some of it to target the money, give cash transfers to the poor, and still reform the subsidies. And reform of these subsidies can have enormous effects on growth. I mean, a lot of the inefficiencies in the electricity system, in the fuel system, are due to the fact that they have been underpricing for a long time, and these losses have led to a lack of maintenance of the electricity grid and poor choices in fuel, in the fuel mix, all of which have undermined the productivity of the Sri Lankan economy. Let me add just one, if I have a minute, add one final thought on this. Frequently, when you try to implement an energy subsidy reform and say, I'm going to accompany it with transfers that are targeted to the poor, the response is, we don't believe you. All that's going to happen is you're going to raise energy prices and not help the poor. And frankly, that has happened in several cases in other countries where they've only done one of the two things that they said they would do, that they'd raise energy prices, but then they didn't compensate the poor. One country, I think, did something ingenious. This was Iran, which actually it had the same problem. In fact, it was a huge problem. Iran subsidies, fuel subsidies, were something like 20% of GDP. Every time they tried to reform it and bring in cash transfers, there were protests in the streets. So they did something very different. They handed out the cash transfers in advance. So people received money in their bank accounts. But the ingenious thing was they could see the money in their bank account, but they couldn't spend it until the subsidies were removed. So all of a sudden, this shifted the politics. People started calling up their parliamentarian and saying, please vote for subsidy reform because I want to spend that money that's in my bank account. And I think this is one way for the government to restore credibility, that it will provide cash transfers to compensate the poor by giving the cash transfers out immediately. And that actually then undermines the clarion call from the non-poor that these subsidies will hurt the poor. The subsidy reforms will hurt the poor. So I think having a well-functioning, well-targeted cash transfer system can open up the space for a lot of the other reforms that will actually generate economic growth in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Professor Shanta. The third proposal will be presented by Professor Udara Peiris, who will join us virtually for his presentation. Professor Peiris joined Oberlin College in the fall of 2022. He is a global academic fellow at Verité Research and a research advisor to the Central Bank of Russia. He has also consulted with the government of Sri Lanka and presented research at institutions including the IMF, Federal Reserve System, Bank of England, and the Reserve Bank of Australia.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to present 3 proposals that can help to avoid a banking crisis in Sri Lanka. My name is Udara Peiris. I'm an associate professor of economics at Oberlin College in the US and a global academic fellow at Verité Research. You can find more information about me on my website, which is www.udarapeiris.org, and my email address is upeiris@oberlin.edu. I've been speaking about these issues and proposals since the very beginning of the crisis, or even before, and I've consistently talked about the need to take financial stability very seriously. In a recent article, I've spoken about these policies that I'm going to cover in a little bit more depth. You can find my articles on my website listed below. So Sri Lanka has done quite well to reach a level of macroeconomic stabilization following the crisis. Nevertheless, it must be acknowledged that countries that have gone through similar debt restructuring restructuring and sovereign debt default episodes tend to find themselves in banking crises. Historically, around 76% of the time when there's a sovereign debt restructure, there's a banking crisis that happens in or near that event. So this is from Leuven and Valencia in 2018. Furthermore, following a sovereign debt restructuring, around 30%, 35% of the time, there's a banking crisis. 50% of the time, there's severe credit declines, and almost 40% of the time, there's a decline in net capital inflow. And this is a paper from Asanuma. So these are things which have happened and things that we need to anticipate in Sri Lanka and to have policies in place that can protect the economy if and when these occur. There are specific risks within the banking system that needs to be acknowledged. The first is reclassification and the realization of problematic loans as non-performing. So if there's an increase in the impairment coverage rate for non-performing loans to 60%, which is what is used in other countries in similar crisis situations, then the capital buffer over the minimum capital requirements will be nearly zero. So this is based on our analysis on publicly available information. Furthermore, if you take the stage 2 loans, which are the loans which are reaching non-performing loan status, this would require an additional 40% coverage, leading to negative capital buffers. The second source of risk is the restructuring of ISBs and SLDBs, which, if they are appropriately provisioned, would again result in a dent in the capital of banks. There's external risks which are occurring as we speak, and these risks can be categorized in 3 ways. The first is external capital flows. The current stance of US monetary policy is highly uncertain of if and when they will start to lower interest rates. And together with the events in the Middle East, there's a concern that the flight to quality will continue to mean capital will be directed back towards the US. The second is the conflicts in the Middle East and Russia-Ukraine has put upward pressure on energy and commodity prices. The price of oil is projected to hit $100 a barrel in the near future. The third risk is the commencement of repayment of the loans, particularly the loans between state-owned enterprises, 2 state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka, which will put additional strain on the fiscal position of the government, and also ultimately the dollar liquidity position in the financial markets. The first proposal I have to deal with these risks is to increase the deposit guarantee limit from 1.1 million currently to 4.4 million. So deposit guarantee limits need to be sufficiently large to disincentivize depositors to withdraw funds. And the increase that I'm proposing will account for the rupee depreciation, inflation, and will be sufficiently high that most depositors will not need to withdraw their funds, even if they have a view that the bank may fail. As a case study, Russia doubled the deposit guarantee limits back in 2014. And even though they have faced a much more difficult external environment and political environment than Sri Lanka, have not had any major bank failures since that time. The second proposal is to establish and capitalize a financial stability fund. So financial stability fund is a ring-fenced amount of money which is able to inject liquidity or capital when there's an imminent bank failure. And the availability of such capital reduces counterparty risks within the financial sector, and of course prevents the failure of banks, which would otherwise have been saved if capital was available. As case studies, the government of Ghana has committed $750 million to a similar fund, and the Greek government has established the Hellenic Financial Stability Fund in 2010, which has been quite successful in staving off several possible bank failures since then. The third proposal is to establish an asset management company or a bad bank, which is essentially a special purpose vehicle which would take off the non-performing loans from the banking sector and hold on to them until they realize or to restructure them. And the possibility of the banks having the non-performing loans taken off their balance sheet reduces the uncertainty of the bank's balance sheets and also frees up the capital which is currently tied to the provisioning of non-performing loans and reduces the need for additional precautionary provisioning, which I had outlined earlier. As a case study, Ireland created NAMA and Spain created SAREB, which are 2 special purpose vehicles following the global financial crisis. These were very large and generally considered successful ventures. The Irish experience was around 15% of GDP was the capital put in, was the value of the assets in the special purpose vehicle, and with SAR it was around 5% of Spanish GDP was the value of the assets. To sum up, joint actions are needed from the central bank, the government, and the IMF to ensure financial stability and to prevent a banking crisis in Sri Lanka. From the central bank, there needs to be funding for the deposit guarantee limits. There needs to be rules established on if and when and how banks can access funds from the Financial Stability Fund. The government needs to allocate resources for the Financial Stability Fund and to create very strong legislation for the asset management companies. It's not enough just to create an SPV. There needs to be strong legislation which can result in restructuring of these non-performing loans. And third, from the IMF, there needs to be assistance both financially and technically to establish the Financial Stability Fund and for the creation of the asset management company. So thank you very much and look forward to the comments and discussions.
Thank you, Professor Udara. The fourth proposal will be presented by Mathisha Arangala, who is the lead economist within the economic research team at Verité Research, who specializes in international trade and investment and is extensively involved in research areas relating to trade facilitation, trade policy reform, environmental impact assessments, industrial policy, and international relations.
Thank you, Mahoshadi. So I would like to take you all through an area which Sri Lanka seems to have neglected over the past few decades, which is our export sector. So if you take a look at this table, we can see that Sri Lanka's exports to GDP has reduced from 33% in the year 2000 to just 18% by 2022. In contrast, most of our key competitors in ASEAN have managed to increase their exports to GDP ratios. And those who had high exports to GDP ratios in the beginning have been able to maintain this. So why is Sri Lanka lagging far behind ASEAN? There are multiple reasons for this. So we would like to take you all through two key issues and proposals that Sri Lanka seems to have overlooked. The first proposal is trade facilitation. So Sri Lankan exporters face multiple barriers when they engage in international trade. And as a result, we have undermined their ability to compete in international markets and also compete with imports coming into the country. And this is where trade facilitation comes in. Trade facilitation entails the reduction of cost and time in trade by streamlining, simplifying, and automating trade procedures. However, it's sad to see Sri Lanka lagging far behind regional competitors when it comes to trade facilitation. If we take a look at Sri Lanka's implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, we can see that since its enactment in 2017, Sri Lanka has just progressed from 29% to 31.5% by June 2023. In contrast, countries who were behind us, like Vietnam, have managed to far surpass us. So Sri Lanka's experience with getting a single window is a good example of Sri Lanka's lethargy and poor attitude towards trade facilitation. Sri Lanka's journey towards a single window actually started back in 1992 with the Asikuda system. And we weren't, in fact, late to the game, because it was only in 1989 that Singapore introduced the TradeNet, their single window. However, 3 decades on, we still don't have a fully functioning single window. And in fact, the new completion date for the single window has been pushed forward to 2030. So while Sri Lankan exporters have to wait till the next decade to get a single window, Singaporean exporters have experienced it since 1989. Our neighbors in India have a single window with 40 agencies on board, and now they even have a single window for business approvals. And ASEAN countries can connect their national single windows into a regional ASEAN single window as well. So what should Sri Lanka really do to catch up to its competitors? So according to the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, countries who are party to the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, can notify the WTO on the measures it feels it requires external assistance to complete. But we can see that Sri Lanka has requested external assistance for a whopping 69% of the trade measures. In contrast, least developed countries, even least developed countries have asked for only external assistance for only 40% of the measures. So this kind of shows Sri Lanka's lack of commitment to trade facilitation, because this means that even least developed countries are willing to complete more measures on their own without waiting for international funding or expertise. So Sri Lanka really needs to reconsider and revise the measures that it says it needs external assistance to complete. And if we take a look at some of these measures, we can see that Sri Lanka has in fact asked for external assistance for things like giving advance notice before legislative changes come in, and things like regular consultations between board agencies and stakeholders. So the question here is, do we really need external assistance to complete these measures? The second issue, the proposal that we would like to bring forth is enhancing the effectiveness and accountability of the National Trade Facilitation Committee. So, countries who are party to the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement can appoint national trade facilitation committees to oversee the implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. However, in Sri Lanka's case, we have identified two key issues which have limited its effectiveness. A, the lack of authoritative high-level leadership. High-level leadership is important for the NTFC, the National Trade Facilitation Committee, because it can help overcome resistance from board agencies. And it can also help the NTFC influence resource allocations. However, Sri Lanka's National Trade Facilitation Committee is headed by the DG of Sri Lanka Customs and the DG of Commerce. In contrast, we can see Vietnam's NTFC is headed by the Deputy Prime Minister. In India, it's the Cabinet Secretary. And in Bangladesh, it's the Minister of Commerce. And the next issue with the NTFC is a lack of accountability. So a few months back, we saw the NTFC implementing or establishing an online monitoring tool to measure and publish the progress of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. However, in order to access this tool, one has to register. And you have to wait a few days to get approval to enter the tool, enter the online platform. In contrast, I, as a Sri Lankan, can even now go and access the action plans and progress reports of the trade facilitation committees of countries like India, Philippines, or even Cambodia. So this really needs to change. And you can access the recent research that we did on trade facilitation by scanning this QR code. So I would like to conclude by saying that exports and FDI have been key drivers of economic growth for our peers in East Asia and Southeast Asia. However, by failing to reduce the time and cost of trade through trade facilitation, we are hampering our exports and also the ability of Sri Lanka to be attractive to foreign investors. So that's the end of the fourth growth proposal, and I would like to hand over the floor to Subhashini.
Thank you, Mathisha. Subhashini Abeysinghe will take us through the last proposal for this segment.
So this is the final proposal of the second segment. Sri Lanka has for a long time been speaking of taking Sri Lankan brands global. So there is one thing Sri Lanka can do to make it a reality that is very important, is to increase the speed and ease of registering trademarks. And how can you do so? So we all know, especially most of the people in the private sector, that it is, trademark registration is the first step towards creating a brand, registering at home and registering abroad. It secures consumer loyalty. It allows you to charge a higher price because people trust your brand name. And it is common sense. And Sri Lanka is known to be a higher cost production destination compared to most of its competitors. That means branding your products helps Sri Lankan companies to face international price competition over quality and consumer loyalty. However, it is not easy to register a trademark abroad. It is a very time-consuming and a costly exercise. This is just a comparison. That is why the world has created a Madrid Protocol that is administered by the World Intellectual Property Organization to make it easy. So if you are a member of the Madrid Protocol versus if you are not a member of the Madrid Protocol, the slide shows you the difference, what companies have to go through if you are not a member, large number of applications to individual entities in intellectual property entities in every country, large amount of legal and administrative fees, and very long time. You can wait for up to 3 to 4 years. Whereas if you're a member of the Madrid Protocol, these costs, time, hassle reduces tremendously. And also you're guaranteed that your trademark will be registered in that country because it's an obligation of the Madrid members within 12 to 18 months. And this is very important if you want to help Sri Lankan companies take their local brands global. So some of our competitors are already in the Madrid Protocol and has been so for a long time. And this is just a list for you to get an idea about who is in the Madrid Protocol among your competitors. And that means compared to companies from these countries who can so easily register their trademarks abroad, Sri Lankan companies are at a competitive disadvantage. Well, just like the maternity benefits, our budget, we recognized the problem, we wanted to address it, and we made a proposal in 2016 budget, actually to access the Madrid Protocol. We are in 2023, but we are not still a member. And from our research, we find that it has taken 4 years to just get cabinet approval to do the necessary amendments to the current intellectual property law. And during this period, from 2017 to 2023, actually 16 other developing country members have joined. So you're still, basically the gap between us and the rest seems to keep on widening. So we've done this research quite some time back. Again, you can find the research by scanning the QR code. So what was presented by Mathisha and earlier by others, what you see is that there are many things governments can do and actually do to make it easier for their companies to succeed abroad, to make them more competitive. But unfortunately, despite having identified the problems and having made proposals, Sri Lanka government seems to have failed to do so, putting Sri Lankan companies at a significant competitive disadvantage. And we do hope, we were talking about tax earnings, so this is where about investing in areas that can generate growth and in turn also bring more tax revenue, which we seem to have failed to do so. That ends the final proposal. Over to you, Maho.
Thank you very much, Subhashini, Professor Peiris, Mathisha, and Professor Devarajan for presenting those timely and very relevant proposals to revitalizing Sri Lanka's growth. We will now move into our second and final panel discussion, an open forum for this evening. To keep your engagement going, please do submit your questions that you may have to the panel by using the Slido feature or requesting for a microphone. To moderate this panel, we are joined by Sabrina Yusufali, who is the Managing Director of Hema's Consumer Brands and an attorney at law of the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. She leads cross-functional teams at Hema's Consumer Brands in sales, marketing, innovation, and supply chain to drive growth and market share in the company's home and personal care brands. Our esteemed panelists for this segment include Dr. De Mel, Professor Devarajan, Professor Peiris, Ms. Subhashini Abeysinghe, and lastly, Duminder Hulangamur, who is the country manager and partner to Ernst & Young Sri Lanka and the Maldives, and the chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. He is a fellow member of both the Chartered Institute of Accountants in Sri Lanka and the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants in the United Kingdom. I would now like to hand over the floor to Sabrina to kickstart our final panel.
Thanks so much, and welcome to the panelists. We heard some really interesting ideas on how to revitalize growth. We heard ideas on how state-funded maternity benefits can actually boost labor force participation, an objective method to target cash transfers better, so that you can push through some of the politically contentious reforms around subsidies, some policy actions to prevent a banking crisis, and also some ideas on improving trade facilitation and trademark protection as a means to boost export competitiveness. So if you have any questions, we'll take about 10 minutes to take questions, and then we'll open up to the panelists to make some closing remarks. There are some questions that have come in online, so I'll maybe start with them first. Subhashini, maybe this question is directed to you.
Yeah.
6 out of 10 people are multidimensionally vulnerable. How has this budget addressed this? Thanks.
So Sabrina, the budget will be presented on 13th November, I believe. So we would only know how exactly the government is addressing the cash transfers and to what extent they have addressed issues like multidimensional poverty. So I would say we still have to wait to know the details, but we hope that this would be considered. Unfortunately, we do not have any advance privilege of knowing what is in the budget.
Thanks, Subhashini. Devinder, can I pass over to you for some opening remarks before we take any more questions?
Yeah, good evening. Yeah. Everyone. I don't know what is in store as questions, but I thought I'll make an opening remark. I've been listening to the various proposals that the speakers made with regard to increased revenue. I want to make a comment on the first proposal on withholding taxes. There's a proposal to increase it to 10%. I must disagree with the proposal. I've been a practitioner for the last 25 years. I'll tell you why the reason for that is. Withholding tax, as the speaker said, is it's not an additional tax. It's only advanced tax. So even if you collect 30 or 40 billion, it won't go into your bucket as additional taxes, because the person who's paying withholding tax will claim it as a credit, so it's not additional tax. Number 2 is with regard to the mechanism at the Illinois Department to give credit to withholding tax. Now keep in mind that this time the withholding tax works 5% across the board, irrespective of how much interest you earn. There is no threshold given this time. In previous years, there was a minimum threshold given for withholding to be liable. Now, even if you are 10,000 rupees or 1 million rupees or 100 million rupees, you pay 5%. If you increase to 10%, then the people who are below the marginal rate of 10% will also pay 10%. There are so many people who are earning 100,000 rupees, 150,000 rupees, 200,000 rupees as interest income. Their marginal tax rate of 10% hits at 350,000 rupees. So if you have a 10% across the board, even the person getting 1 rupee will pay 10%. And there is no mechanism to give you credit for that. That's number 1. 2. Number 3 is that currently there are about, I think for a month, all commercials bank put together, about 3 to 4 million depositors. And there will be 3 to 4 million entries going every month on withholding tax to the Illinois Department. So for a year, you will have about 100 million remittances coming from the respective banks to the department. There is no mechanism at the Inland Revenue to digitally compare this with your payment. The only proof the department has that you have paid withholding tax is the certificate given by the bank. So, but when you go to the assessor, he can say, I can't trace this in the department cash book. I can't see this bank statement. So there is no way of digitally matching, because department has 2 bank accounts, the Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank, and all the tax payments coming to that. So you have about 4 million tax payments coming for a month. And each bank uploads it on a monthly basis. There is no way that they can identify who has paid how much. So without having a mechanism for giving credit, you cannot increase withholding tax rate. Now, for instance, today, if you see, there are so many corporates who are receiving default notices. And those default notices date back to 20 or 30 years. Some are 2000, 1995, 2010. Why? Because those are all withholding taxes, where the department is unable to give credit to you in their system. Now, when you file your income tax return, although you have paid 5% withholding tax, in the department system, there is no credit given to you. In department system, the 5% that you paid will remain outstanding taxes, because there is no matching that to the bank statement. So you make it 10%, it will be worse. So that's why I'm saying if you increase it 10%, there is no additional rent to the government. You are giving a free hand to the assessor department and the inland department just to collect taxes. The inefficiency will grow. There is no method, or at least there is no attempt to increase the tax rate. They just take the tax in. So that is where the issue with the tax is. That's why government abolished it 5 years ago, because the department is unable to give credit to the withholding tax. That you take into account when you're making a proposal.
Thanks, Suminder. Nishan, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Suminder, I have my, obviously it's really great to hear your thoughts on that. Can I just kind of test my sense of a response to what you're saying? And it would be as follows, right? That the first point about, well, it doesn't bring additional revenue. It doesn't bring additional revenue if everyone who should be paying tax is already paying tax and has a tax file and pays their full tax and then claims this as a refund. You and I both know a large number of people who the only tax they pay is the withholding tax, and they should be paying a great deal in tax. So if that's as long as we have this problem of the tax net being too small, withholding tax is likely to grow revenue. But if the tax net got to 50, 60%, and we thought everybody was paying tax, maybe then withholding tax doesn't matter anymore. But in the current situation, maybe it does, is I think the way I think about it. The second issue, and the third issue, second issue is about, okay, people are paying too much because people under a certain income who shouldn't pay are paying. And of course, that shouldn't be the case. And that can be dealt in two ways, I think. One is that we had a method to give older citizens a higher interest rate in the bank. Now, if you could make that work successfully, then everyone who registers themselves saying my income is below a certain amount or gets a tax direction from the inland revenue to that point can be given the same treatment, have the withholding tax not deducted, because we already had a system to treat certain groups differently, and we can implement it. The second, and your second and third point is, the other thing you said, I think, was about how this will increase the number of entries. I didn't think that, because whether it's 5% or 10%, it's one entry. So you don't flood the inland revenue with more, because it's only the quantum deducted that changes. It's not the number of entries that go. But I think most of your concern was focused around the inefficiency of the inland revenue, the non-recognition of your payment, the difficulty to get a refund. And I would have thought that the solution is to actually fix that, and to create a huge demand for that to get fixed. Now, it's that inefficiency of the system that is actually killing tax revenue and killing the possibility of a fairer tax system and the country coming out of the problem. And perennially, we live with that problem because it doesn't affect enough people, and the people who don't pay taxes are quite happy. But maybe this is kind of from a political economy dynamic, a useful way, because I agree 100% with you that that's unfair, but surely are we going to be such an underdeveloped country that forever we say we can't do anything about a uselessly functioning inland revenue? I think Shamini Kure in her central bank oration said the same thing. There's no way we can not take responsibility for fixing that. So that's just my thought. Maybe Shanta or others have any other thought?
So I mean, I don't want to sort of harp on the subject because there are matters taken up. But unless you fix the, I don't think we can implement it until you fix the problem. Because there is a digitalization program taking place. I think until that is done, I don't think you can fix the problem. So whatever we propose must be practical also to implement. So it sounds nice as a proposal, but implementation is very difficult. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thanks. There's a question that I'll club together and probably target it to Subhashini. On improving export and international trade, has Verité analyzed critical trade facilitation agreements Sri Lanka needs to get into and what might be the roadblocks? And related to that, how easy is it for us to be a signatory member of the Madrid Protocol if we have had the framework in place?
So first one, trade facilitation agreements. At the moment, there is only one within the World Trade Organization. So I don't know whether the question was about trade agreements per se or trade facilitation. I wonder whether somebody, the person who asked, can clarify. So trade facilitation can be an important part of trade agreements. Now that is what we call basically Sri Lanka is, I call WTO TFA or the Trade Facilitation Agreement as ABC, like the basic of trade facilitation. If you saw the numbers that Mathisha put up, you could see in 2017 when we signed the Trade Facilitation Agreement, most of our competitors like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines had already completed 70, 80, 90% of the measures. That means these countries have done all of these way before, WTO came up with an agreement because it was good for them to do so. And today, so what most of the trade agreements do is actually go beyond the WTO. So World Trade Organization is a difficult place to agree on anything because you have 160 odd countries trying to agree on one thing. We know how two countries, Sri Lanka and India or Sri Lanka and China, finds it difficult to agree on things. So it's always difficult. So what they do in bilateral and regional agreements is they actually go beyond WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. I know Sri Lanka had stated its interest in joining RCEP. That's again a good example to show how if you go through the agreement, they want you to implement trade facilitation measures that go beyond what the WTO requires. On the Madrid Protocol, so actually the World Intellectual Property Organization has clearly outlined what a country needs to do to be a member of the protocol. We were talking about institutional efficiency. That is one of the core criteria. So anyone who has dealt with the Intellectual Property Office of Sri Lanka keeps on telling me that it is very difficult to get anything registered and it takes a long time. So one of the most important thing is as a member of the protocol, you're going to agree to register trademarks within a shorter period than the period we take. So it's very important institutional efficiency. And of course, there are certain amendments to the law. So this requires, again, another point of where do we want to allocate resources from the budget? And these are not very costly exercises either. But what is very important, there was a gentleman who asked about growth enhancing. So it's not about taxing, but how tax money is used also to enhance growth. So I think what you need to see is there are 16 countries from 2017 to today that has joined, and all 16 are developing, which means countries can do it and they do it. So it's really about your commitment and interest in getting it done.
Thank you. Let me open up for questions in the audience. Does anyone have any questions for the panelists?
The question was actually with regards to free trade agreements as opposed to trade facilitation. Apologies if it was misunderstood.
Yeah. Why not free trade agreements, I suppose? Yeah.
Yes. My first question is regarding this tax on professionals, especially the pay tax. They are the last year, 22, the expected income was about 15 billion. So this year, the government was to get 100 billion. So it's a 6 times increase. So actually from the sectors, so this is the highest, the number of that the tax they have collected. By now, they have collected the expected tax of 100 million, right? So other sectors, they have not done. Also, the impact on the professionals is very great, and so many people are leaving, and so many people are having a lot of difficulties of paying this tax, right? And they actually, it's whatever the reason, they have violated the one basic principle of the affordability. Now these professionals, now doctors, engineers, accountants, and everybody, so they have been telling this, but I can't see any response from the government sector. So this is the first thing. The second thing, any year, so we are only talking about that particular year's current year's revenue and the current year's expenditure. So what about the last few years uncollected the taxes is amounted about 800 to 900 billion. So we are not really making big effort to collect that tax. So that also directly the inefficiency of the inland revenue. So inefficiency of the inland revenue or excise department or the custom, that actually the government should have some mechanism to correct that. So it's not correct or it's not fair to impose more and more taxes from the people where you can easily collect it. That is very unfair. Thanks.
Thank you. Nishan, do you want to respond to that? And
or let Subhashini respond to the trade question first,
sure.
And then maybe, sorry, thanks.
So free trade agreements, there are two sides to the story. One is, so for free trade agreements to be feasible for smaller countries like Sri Lanka, the main interest in entering a trade agreement is to obtain market access. So basically, you must have sufficient number of companies in the country and sectors that feel confident and interested in accessing a foreign market. So unfortunately, if you look at Sri Lanka's export basket or the number of companies that actually engage in international trade, there are very few. And very few people feel confident to be able to, say for example, go to a market like India or to a China and be competitive and compete. So as a result, many companies who rely heavily on domestic market, who also are saddled with a lot of government red tape and policy inconsistency that increases their cost of doing business and makes it difficult to do business in Sri Lanka, obviously feel more scared of competing with imports that come from countries that actually provide better facilitation for their traders and exporters. So you need to really, if you want to succeed, as a result, politically it has been very challenging to really agree to the terms and conditions of free trade agreements of most of our partners. And what is important to know is there is very little room to negotiate with most of these partners like India or China because they already have established frameworks and agreed rules with so many other countries, and they find it very difficult to bend those rules and be more flexible to Sri Lanka because then they seem unfair, right? So as a result, what you really need to do is two things that Sri Lanka is not necessarily doing. We need to definitely look for more products. We can't forever be exporting apparel, tea, rubber, and coconut and spices. And that is one way how countries like Singapore and Thailand succeeded by actually getting into electronics, electric vehicles, automobiles. So you need to really diversify and diversify into sectors that are export-oriented, not domestic market-oriented. So if you look at most East Asian countries, they succeeded by attracting investments, by encouraging their domestic businesses to go into export-oriented business. But again, simultaneously, you need to really reduce barriers to engage in business, barriers to trade across borders that are created by Sri Lankan government. So my issue has always been Sri Lanka can't be just simply seeking trade agreements to liberalize trade without making equal or more emphasis into reducing cost and time of doing business in Sri Lanka or engaging with international trade from Sri Lanka, because you're not going to succeed either way.
thank you. Tuminda, would you like to take the question on tax?
On taxation. I'm not representing government, but I can, because your first question was on policy. But from what I know, the 15 billion was based on the old tax rates and on the basis of self-assessment and payment. So what happened, people who used to pay PAY paid on the self-assessment system, so that was not captured the PAY value. But the total PAY collection was estimated to be 100 billion, and they achieved 100 billion based on the increase of the rates and bringing everyone back into the PAY system. Because we had 2 years where people were given the option of paying tax on their own. Some didn't pay, some paid, but they paid on self-assessment. So it didn't come out of the PAY value. That's why there's a distortion of the value. But essentially, it has gone up because rates have gone up. On your question of outstanding taxes, this is a myth, as I told you. 800 billion, in fact, if there are parliamentarians, I would have told them, the COPA, everyone, there is no 800 billion tax due. 800 billion is appearing in department records, all outstanding taxes not updated by the department. As I told, withholding taxes have not got updated because there is no method of updating it. So it appears as outstanding. Number two, most of the assessments that have been raised for additional tax are in court or in appeal, so they can't be collected. So that is where the outstanding tax now. On return taxes, people pay. What you want to file as a return, on return tax people pay, and on return tax is 96% of the total collection. Only 4% come from additional assessments. 96% is on return self-declared taxes, so which means 4% is a penetration for additional taxes. So the 800 billion is not a correct figure. So just to touch outside taxation, Sabri, if you permit me from the chamber side, just to say what we have been fairly engaged with government, stabilization stage, reform stage, and even now. We had 2 or 3 closed-door sessions with government on the budget. And our view is that we have to look at short-term benefits, in short to medium term, how we can take the economy to grow. I saw the slide on exports. You can't grow exports overnight. It will take time because whatever government does, there has to be opportunity also for exporting. But we feel the chamber, the low-hanging fruit, the lowest, there are 3 low-hanging fruits which I capture on. One is tourism. And we have infrastructure. If we make certain changes in legislation, where we create free areas, we increase tourism from 2 to 5 million, that will be a big boost to the local economy because there are a lot of people who are directly and indirectly employed in tourism. And we feel tourism is a lowest hanging fruit. With a better marketing, we can get tourists to come to Sri Lanka. That is because manufacturing and exporting takes time. And our industrial base is not competitive as other countries because our cost of production is very high. We drive large. Our consumption is dropping. Sabrina will know that. Our consumption is dropping because of the high tax rates and inflation and interest rates are high. So what we are concentrating on is tourism to be up, and number 2 is the BPO IT industry. Because we have about 150,000, 200,000 people coming out of the system where we can produce them, fast-track them to the BPO IT industry. There's enough opportunity for Sri Lankans to sell the services because we have to, I don't think Sri Lanka can be a manufacturing goods country, it's a manufacturing service country. And number 3 is the ports and shipping area. You have seen the DCF funding coming for the John Adhering project, a $500 million. That is a huge, I think, investment that came, a good signal for the country to say that people are looking at Sri Lanka again. So we need to get areas where Sri Lanka can have short-term fix the problem, the short-term, medium term. Others are slightly long-term in terms of how they're going to do. And also we have given a proposal to government to liberalize a lot of areas for foreign direct investments that are hitherto not opened up, like education, agriculture, plantation industries. There is no need to close those industries. Mining, we have said to liberalize, give 100% export, and there are enough people to come, even without tax incentives. So we are trying to see how we can liberalize those areas as soon as possible and invite FDI, and then promote Sri Lankans to go overseas, largely to the ASEAN countries. We are taking delegations to Indonesia, try to open the ASEAN markets for FTAs. This is the RSPEC country, not easy. We had a very productive discussion with the Indian Finance Minister when she was here last week. She's willing to open up the basket of goods that are subject to restrictions in India so that our exports can, those are immediate things that we can do. So we're trying to see, that's just to give some up of what the Chamber has been doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Duminder. I think we can wrap up on that note. Thank you so much to the panelists and the speakers that gave us interesting ideas on how to revitalize growth, not just in terms of domestic proposals, but also in terms of boosting our export competitiveness. Thanks, and thanks to the audience for your questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you to our moderator, Sabrina, and our eminent panelists, Professor Peiris, Professor Devarajan, Subhashini Abeysinghe, Mr. Duminder Hulangamur, for that insightful discussion. I would now like to invite Dr. de Mel to take the stage and to deliver the closing remarks.
I think Mahoshadi has already said the thank yous, and I don't want to take up time in closing remarks, except to just very quickly, perhaps, summarize what we've done today, okay? We spoke in 2 sessions, one about increasing revenue, the other about increasing growth and efficiency. And we put up 5 proposals on each side. And just to remind you, I'll run through them in 1.5 minutes. The first was increasing withholding tax. Of course, Duminda gave some alternative views of why it may not be practical to do too quickly, or why we need to focus on improving the administration to make that feasible. But the enormous opportunity of raising 90 billion plus and taking a huge leap forward in terms of being able to reduce other kinds of regressive taxes and make it a progressive tax that has to be looked at. Second was introducing property taxes. Mick came late and talked about it. Sri Lanka gets 0.05% of GDP in property taxes. As Mick pointed out, you can get 0.5 to globally in GDP. Countries collect between 0.5 to 1%. That means 10 to 20% more in GDP than we do. Our proposal is to start by at least doubling it, and Mick laid out the methods by which we can do that. The third one was really removing discretion, which is abused in extremely problematic ways in Sri Lanka, that allows revenue to get leaked. And the IMF has also a proposal on taking away things like special commodity levy, but also discretion to give tax holidays. Sri Lanka kept doling out tax holidays even in the last 2 years in the middle of a crisis, and that is because of too much discretion that is available in the system to determine tax concessions. We talked about discretion as a fourth proposal in terms of tobacco taxation, that it has to be fair for everybody, it has to be rational, and we have a method published, agreed by other research institutes in the country that allow taxation to be on a rational formula that takes away discretion and increases revenue. And last of all, we said, look, the way you make sure state-owned enterprises recover full cost is not by simply loading the consumer with the inefficiency cost, but taking that from taxes, and doing that can actually increase government revenue because there are competing industries otherwise that make super profits on the high prices you introduce. On the growth and efficiency side, we talked about how a simple thing, 6 billion, sort of peanuts, for state-funded maternity leave benefits can make such a huge difference in increasing labor force participation and the workforce contribution of women. We talked about the efficiency methods that exist to improve cash transfers and reforming state subsidies, that the subsidies of the state are misallocated. They're going too much towards people who have and too little towards people who don't, and that and Shanta talked about the different ways of reforming and changing that. I won't summarize Udara's 3 points, but simply excluding banks from domestic debt restructure is not the way you save banks, but by taking the proper measures to create banks, to create crisis funds, to actually, to help the banks where they need them. And the capital adequacy is not the bank's problem, but non-performing loans, for instance, is the significant problem. And to actually target the kind of help that has been done and tried and tested in other countries, which didn't exclude their banking sector, but actually protected them. Then Mathisha and Subhashini talked about trade facilitation and how Sri Lanka has really become a laggard behind even the least developed countries, showing very little commitment. So the problem of, somebody asked about trade agreements, we assume with trade agreements that the problem for export market access is in the border of other countries, and what this proposal said is the problem is in Sri Lanka's own border. And we have to solve the problems at our border, and really the problems at other people's border don't even arise for Sri Lanka, because we can't get stuff out of our own border due to the problems that are created, and that can be helped. Then last of all, that Sabrina, who moderated that panel, is one of the entrepreneurs in the private sector, growing brands in Sri Lanka, growing products that can be globally famous, but people like that are hampered because registering our brands abroad is so difficult. There's a global system to do it, very easy to accede to it. So many less developed countries acceded to the Madrid Protocol. Since we wrote this proposal 5 years ago, Sri Lanka still doesn't do it, and it creates enormous red tape and difficulties. So these are not all the proposals we have. We invite you to go to our website, contact others at Verité, and look at the many, many ways in which we've suggested how government can move forward to take the country towards a viable economic recovery. And we think that we saw the taxes, the SCL increase already happened. So government has picked up different ideas. Not all of them, even when announced, are implemented. I think the idea is that we should look to see how we can all work together to take these approaches, incorporate them into the plan, and then implement them effectively. And if that happens, I think Sri Lanka still has a chance on getting on a path to recovery and making this debt restructure the only restructure we do, because that is the absolute risk we are looking at. That if we don't actually work urgently and with intentionality, to avoid a secondary structure, currently that is the path in which Sri Lanka is headed. So thank you very much for being here, and we hope you'll all be ambassadors for these ideas in the country, and that we can all become a part of the solution. Thank you very much. Good night.